All right, let's talk about something that hits home for literally every single New Yorker. Whether you own property or not, the city's wild and, frankly, baffling property tax system. But we're not just going to talk about the problem. We're going to explore a really radical solution that could change, well, everything.
You know, you don't have to take my word for it that the system is broken. That quote, convoluted and its outcomes unjust, that's not from some angry protester. That's how the system gets described in official analyses. When the official descriptions sound that bad, you know we've got a serious problem on our hands.
And if you want to see what unjust actually looks like, this is it. It's just wild. A multi-million-dollar penthouse right on Central Park South pays an effective tax rate of just 0.22%. But a regular two-family home out in Canarsie, they're paying a rate almost 5 times higher. How is that even possible? Well, to understand that, we've got to pop the hood on the current system. Okay, first up, let's try to unravel this thing. New York City's puzzling property tax. We're going to see where these bizarre outcomes actually come from.
So the whole mess really starts here, with something called the four-class system. Back in 1981, the city decided to sort every single property into one of 4 buckets. You got single-family homes in one, big office buildings in another, and so on. And here's the crazy part. Each of these 4 buckets plays by a completely different set of rules. Different ways of valuing property, different caps on tax increases. The whole thing is a maze that creates winners and losers based on weird, arbitrary categories, not on actual wealth.
And look, this isn't some small niche issue. We are talking about massive amounts of money. Property taxes alone bring in $35 billion, with a B. That's the single biggest chunk of the city's entire $122 billion budget. So the takeaway is pretty clear. When a system this big is this unfair, it has huge consequences for everything. Our schools, our subways, you name it. But what if we could just scrap the whole thing and start over? Well, that brings us to a really fascinating and radical alternative, the land value tax. So the idea is actually pretty simple. A land value tax, or LVT, basically ignores whatever building is on a piece of land. It doesn't matter if you have a huge skyscraper or just an empty parking lot. The tax is based only on the value of the land itself. And that means any renovations you do, any new building you put up, any improvements you make, all of that would be completely tax-free. And this really gets to the core philosophy of it. So why only tax the land? Well, think about it. What makes a piece of land in the middle of Manhattan so valuable? It's not because of something the owner did, right? It's all the stuff the community built around it, the subways, the parks, the good schools. The idea with an LVT is to tax that value the community created instead of punishing you with higher taxes for improving your own property. Okay, so what would this actually look like in practice, in a place like New York City? Well, this is where things get really interesting. The analysis we looked at lays out 3 different scenarios, and each one gets a little more radical than the last. The first one is a pretty straightforward swap. Just replace the current property tax. The second scenario kicks it up a notch. Replace all local taxes. We're talking sales tax, income tax, the whole shebang. And the third one? That's the most extreme. It would replace all local taxes and a big chunk of federal aid the city gets. So let's start with scenario 1. To replace the $35 billion that the city currently gets from property taxes, you just need a citywide land value tax of 1.25%. That's it. One single, transparent rate for everyone. Now for scenario 2, what if we could get rid of the city's sales tax and the city's income tax and all the business taxes and roll it all into one? To replace that massive $83 billion pot of money, the LVT rate would have to jump up to 2.97%. And finally, the most ambitious idea of all. Scenario 3 imagines a world where New York could actually do without almost $9 billion in federal aid. To replace all local taxes and that federal money, giving the city incredible financial independence, the rate would need to go up one more time to 3.33%. You can really see the climb right here. We go from a pretty simple replacement all the way to a complete overhaul of how the city even pays its bills. And that, of course, brings us to the biggest question of all. Who would this actually help and who would it hurt? So that brings us to the most important part of this whole discussion. Let's talk about the real-world winners and losers in a system like this.
So who comes out on top? Well, renters and developers would probably be big fans. Not taxing new buildings creates a huge incentive to build more housing, which could finally bring down costs. The biggest losers? People sitting on super valuable but underused land. Think about a parking lot in Midtown Manhattan. Their tax bill would absolutely skyrocket. And in those more radical scenarios, low and middle-income families and small businesses would also see a huge benefit from getting rid of sales, income, and corporation taxes.
Of course, an idea this huge, this revolutionary, doesn't just happen overnight. So before we get too carried away, we have to take a hard look at the reality of actually making this happen. So if this system seems so much more fair and efficient on paper, what's really standing in the way? Well, the political hurdles are just immense. First, you'd have powerful landowners and real estate groups fighting you tooth and nail. Second, any change has to be approved by the state government in Albany, which is never easy. Then, you have to convince voters to accept a new tax, even if it's just replacing old ones. That's always a tough sell. And finally, think about all the major nonprofits and universities sitting on prime real estate. They'd suddenly face huge tax bills, creating another really powerful group of opponents.
And the economic challenges are just as serious. You'd need a bulletproof way to assess land values fairly and accurately across all 5 boroughs. You'd also have to handle a likely short-term dip in land prices. And maybe most importantly, you'd have to design a super careful transition, probably with rebates, to make sure you don't create an economic shock for regular homeowners and businesses.
But here's the final twist. As hard as this change would be, the risk of doing nothing is also huge. If we stick with the current system, we're just accepting the unfairness. We're accepting that it stifles economic growth by up to 1% of GDP every year, and we're leaving the city's budget vulnerable to the ups and downs of income and sales taxes. So doing nothing isn't exactly a safe option either.
So that's really the bottom line, isn't it? Is a land value tax the necessary revolution New York City needs to fix a system that everyone agrees is convoluted and unjust? Or is it just an impossible dream, doomed by all the political and economic roadblocks? There's no easy answer, but whichever way it goes will shape the future of this city for decades to come.